Hey guys. I'm Elizabeth Height, and today I'm doing my presentation on Robert Nozick, specifically on his section about patterned distribution. So one of the main things that he discusses in this thing, he spends a good bit defining what pattern distribution is, and he's got a very broad kind of definition of what pattern distribution can be. One of the things he says is that it's based on natural dimensions, or a sum of multiple natural dimensions, and he doesn't really define what he means by natural dimensions. He just kind of says, and he states in the text that he leaves it vague, because they can be a very wide range of things. It can vary from merit, moral merit, to IQ. Very very wide range there of things to talk about. He also says that distribution is patterned if it follows a patterned principle. So yeah, he describes the merit-based, the moral merit-based pattern as easily identifiable as a patterned thing, because you reward certain moral behaviors, and it's predetermined what that is, and it's something that you can change to strive towards. So it's a very clear cut, make a pattern of these behaviors, and as a result of that pattern, you will be rewarded in a similar pattern based on the actions. So that's pretty straightforward. But the IQ, he mentions that it doesn't look at the person's past actions. It just looks at a number, so it's a little harder to see as a pattern. But one of the things he describes is a patterned distribution, or a pattern that you can distribute by, is an ordered list of things. Say helping old people with their groceries is something good that you will be rewarded for. But better than helping old people with their groceries is donating X amount of dollars to a charity. And so it's a tiered system of reward and merit. So that's more where the IQ thing would fall, I suppose. He talks about gift giving, as far as transference of property, and he says that gift giving is not a patterned distribution, because it doesn't result from solely, I should say, from predetermined criteria that have been met, if that makes sense. It comes from the desire of individuals to either be generous or pass on a belonging of theirs to a relative, that kind of thing. So that's more the desire of the individual, instead of the patterned distribution, more coming from a societal desire to reward good behavior, good in the eyes of the society. So that can be anything from the good behavior, could be anything from moral excellence to intelligence to how useful you were perceived to be to the society, that kind of thing. But gift giving, he says, is not a patterned distribution. And there are strands of pattern in gift giving. And he says that's in situations where gifts are given with the expectation of something in return. Think of a birthday party. You go to the birthday party to enjoy the cake and to spend time with people. These are things you are expecting in like return for giving the person a gift. You are expecting a certain kind of like social exchange in return for the gift you've given. So he says that although gift giving can like be mostly without pattern, the process of it is not. So like when you go to give a gift, like you have to think about what you're going to give the person. How are you going to acquire that thing? Usually, in our society, we exchange like money for a product, like say a book. If you're giving someone a book, you exchange money at a bookstore for that book, and that is like the like principle of acquisition of holdings that he talks about, where it's like you trade something perceived to be of like equal value, and then the actual act of like giving it is following like the principle of transfer of holdings. So he says that kind of falls into like a pattern there. So it's kind of, it's not like pattern distribution in the way that he initially defines it, but there is a pattern to the distribution. And then, give me one sec here, flipping my notes. And then he starts talking about like Hayek. And so he says that Hayek argues that we can't like know every individual's like situation and their like past and their motivations. So we wouldn't be able to use like moral merit as a method of like pattern distribution. And Nozick says that, you know, even if we did have access to the information that Hayek's talking about, would that be a just like patterned distribution, or would it just be patterned? I realize my wording there is a little so I'm going to clarify a little more. So if we had that knowledge, would justice dictate that we use that knowledge as a method of distribution? Or is using that knowledge just the pattern and not involved in like justice? So Nozick also points out that like Hayek rejects the idea of like a, and I'm quoting here, deliberately chosen pattern of distribution. So Hayek says, no, the heck with that. We don't want that. Because like that's he thinks it's unjust to impress that on a society. Whereas later on he goes on to suggest that distribution should be in accordance with the, and I'm quoting again, perceived value of a person's actions and services to others. So he's saying that, oh no, we shouldn't have like a pattern distribution. That's not just. Let's use this pattern to distribute things. It's just a little hypocritical, a little problematic, but what can you do? So Nozick like points out that like Hayek is against it until it's his own like personally approved pattern, which I think is interesting and important to note. Nozick also goes into how Hayek's idea, like for that to work, one would have to like set standards for like how much value certain actions have. And for like how much someone is expected to contribute based on like their resources that are available to them and like their ability to do so. So like we could set like donation to a particular charity is like a good like moral like act, and that should be rewarded. But the question of like how much one should donate and if that should be like proportionate to how much someone earns, that's the kind of thing that like Nozick is talking about here. Because like without these kind of like set, like preset rules, I guess, then Hayek's whole thing there, the whole like moral merit thing, is arbitrary and wouldn't really work out functionally. So Nozick says that Hayek is correct, that like in thinking that like the benefit of one's actions is an important like factor, I guess, in a free capitalist society. But he says that this pattern is just one of many like strands that like holds the society. So like what he means by that, I think, is like so like moral goodness and like reward for moral goodness is an important part of our society, but it's not the only like form, like the only pattern of distribution, because there are things like gift giving and inheritance that like that's not based on moral goodness. It's based on who your parents were, and that kind of thing, and like who your friends are. So I think that's one of Nozick's like more important points, is like, hey, I agree with you to a degree, Hayek, but dial it back a little. Then he says, Nozick says that like what we crave in a like society is reason and logic as far as patterned distributions, or rather distributions in general, are concerned. He says that we want to know like why someone makes the decision they make. Whereas Hayek thinks that society wants to look and act just. He thinks that we are motivated by justice in figuring out a system of like distribution. And Nozick poses a question here. Must a society be just? I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Must a just society follow pattern distribution? Does the distribution have to be patterned in order for that society to look just? Even if it's not actually like just, for it to look just, does it have to be pattern distribution? Nozick says, again, like we really just crave like the reason and logic there behind these decisions. Because if someone just went around like willy-nilly, just like randomly spinning like, oh, I feel like giving you like a chicken for my groceries today, and you get no say in the matter, and this is a completely arbitrarily picked like payment for this thing, that would lead to some issues. People would get angry, people would disagree, there would be a lot more like social dissonance. But Nozick says that even if the like trade off there doesn't make sense, and I mean even if it doesn't seem fair, as long as like we can see the person's logic into how they like came to that decision, then like we'll be content. An example of this is like when I was younger, when I still collected Pokemon cards, I traded a Glaceon for a Celebi. And for those of you who don't know Pokemon, a Celebi is a much more valuable Pokemon than a Glaceon. I, however, didn't really care about how powerful the Pokemon was because I didn't actually play the game. I just collected the cards. And my motivation there was I wanted to collect all of the Pokemon that evolved from Eevee. So the Eeveelutions. And Glaceon is one of those, and Celebi is not. So there was a logic there to my decision to trade that Celebi for the Glaceon. Even if it didn't make like sense as far as gaining a stronger Pokemon, because the Glaceon was weaker. But like I'm pretty sure we'll all be able to see like my motivation behind it. There was a reason, there was logic that went into making that decision. So That pretty much sums up like most of what Nozick talked about. Um, I created a like survey just to kind of see if you guys like understood Nozick's like section on pattern distribution. And I'm gonna post a link to it like here on the screen. So I just ask that you guys take like maybe 5 minutes to just go through and answer that, just so I can see if you guys understood it or how I did. So yeah, that should conclude my presentation today. Thank you for your time. Have a nice break, y'all.